Welcome to One Work, 5 Questions with Donna Vitek and Dr. Mark Andrew Holowchak. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Holowchak.
Glad to be here as usual.
Yes, it's always a wonderful thing to look forward to on Sunday, learning more about Mr. Thomas Jefferson, or President Thomas Jefferson, I should say.
And having little Jefferson on my lap again. He knows when this thing happens. The only time he jumps on my lap, he must like to be on camera.
Oh, he's a ham.
You're a hot dog, huh? Just like your owner.
Dr. Holowchak is a PhD retired professor of philosophy and history who taught at institutions such as University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Rutgers University, Camden, and Ohio University. He's the editor of Journal of Thomas Jefferson and His Time, and author and editor of numerous published books and close to 150 essays on Thomas Jefferson. His list of books and the location of his published essays can be found in the video description. With our show One Work, 5 Questions, I'll ask Dr. Holowchak 5 questions on one work of Thomas Jefferson's. And today's episode is on Thomas Jefferson's Ordinance of 1784. So I am new to this, and I was very excited for what I learned from reading his ordinance and the history of why he was chosen. So I'd like to share this introduction with everyone. We left off last week with my interest in learning about Thomas Jefferson's involvement with the expansion of the West. The expansion west. Most of us are familiar with the Louisiana Purchase that was authorized by our third president, Thomas Jefferson. But how many of you were aware of his involvement with the expansion west shortly after the Revolutionary War? That was the thing I was not aware of. And this was also prior to the Louisiana Purchase. Today, we will learn about Thomas Jefferson's involvement with the land relinquished to America as part of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. This land was west of the Appalachian Mountains and north of the Ohio River, doubling the size of the United States. How would these states be governed? Would they enter the Union as slave states or free states? And so you'll join us today to hear the answers to these questions and much more. And I'm Donna Vitek, and this is One Work, 5 Questions. Are you ready, Dr. Holowchak?
I'm as ready as I can be.
Okay, question number 1. What was the purpose of the committee that Congress formed in 1783 after the Revolutionary War?
You talked about it concerned lands to the north and west of the Ohio River. And after the Revolutionary War, the United States came in possession of those lands. And it was a matter of, okay, what are we going to do with those lands? How do we divide them up? They needed a plan to divide the lands that were granted to the United States by England after the Revolutionary War. Now, Jefferson was appointed by the Congress to head a committee after the Treaty of Paris, which formally ended the war. Mm-hmm. And he was on the committee with Jeremiah Townley Chase of Maryland and David Howe of Rhode Island. So he's there with a couple Northerners. It's only fitting because much of the land about which we're concerned is Northwestern land. So you need people who are Northerners part of the committee. And okay, so this was approved on the 23rd of April of 1784 by a 22-2 margin. The land, we have a picture of it, right?
Yes, we do. I will show
the land is today what we would call modern Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and let me look at your picture. Part of, as you can see, the Mississippi River, they're part of Minnesota as well, the upper tip there. So, and that's what we're talking about. That was, the committee, and it was just drawn up to try to figure out what we're going to do with all this land we came in. And Jefferson, I'll say in a little bit, was the perfect person to head a committee like that.
Oh, yes. I think from what I've learned from past episodes of our show, his idea of how he divides things, that I thought so too, especially when I looked at the map and the the evenness of everything. Question number 2, what was Jefferson's proposition for the division of the land?
To answer that question, keep the picture up. You can see that, of course, he's putting a grid and trying to come up with sort of rectangular parcels of land, but you're dealing with the borders of Ohio, of the Ohio River and the Mississippi River. But within those confines, he's trying to come up and he's proposing to create 10 new states. I don't want to call them states, at least the possibilities for 10 new states.
Right.
He comes up with 5. If you read the report, comes up with 5 provisos. The first is that the new states will be, he says, forever part of the United States, whatever that means. He says the persons, the property, and the territory are subject to the Continental Congress and the Articles of Confederation. And I'll say more about the Articles of Confederation because the Articles of Confederation weren't very strict. That's why we needed a constitution. Once these territories would become states, they would be taxed like other states. Again, with the Articles of Confederation, the federal government, there really wasn't a federal government per se other than the Congress. And there were difficulties in collecting. There were great debts after the Revolutionary War, and the states were supposed to, donate money to clear up those debts, and that never really happened. The states, number 4, said they're going to be Republican, and there's going to be no hereditary title, meaning presumably that any person who wants to claim a parcel, people can buy parcels of land, corporations can, but any person wants to say, I'm deserving of a parcel of land because of my name or something like that. Right. And then he says after the year 1800, there's going to be no slavery or indentured servitude. Now, why 1800? Well, this is in 1784, 16 years later is 1800. And the reason for that is to give, the slave states, to give people time to deal with the issue of slavery. You can't just abolish it immediately. Right. Of course, they did that in the Civil War, and with disastrous consequences. People who owned plantations just were broke, immediately broke. All their money was in their slaves and indentured servants and so forth. So. Okay, talking about your question concerned division of the land, and I'm going to delve into some other stuff here. Those are the 5 provisos that he gives, and then he talks of in another report on this Western Territory in April. I'll read a little passage I pulled out. It shall be divided, the land, into hundreds of 10 geographical miles square, each mile containing 6,086 feet in 4/10 of a foot, by lines to be run and marked due north and south, and others crossing at right angles. And if you look at the picture, you can see not lines north and south, the vertical lines, and then the horizontal lines of east and west. At right angles, the first of which lines each way shall be at 10 miles distance from one of the corners of the state within which they shall be. These hundreds shall be divided into lots of 1 mile square each, or 850 acres in 4/10 of an acre, marked lines running in the like manner, due north and south, and others crossing these at right angles. So he's talking about vertical lines, and he's talking about horizontal lines to be parceled out at right angles. Now, how are we going to, how did they do this at the time? Well, they would, and here's I bring in my really pathetically bad props. They would bring in, and there goes Jefferson bolting from my lap, but they would bring in chain and measure out distance by chain. Chain makes a lot of sense because, when it's heated, when it's hot outside, of course, it's going to span ever so little, but it's a pretty constant way of marking up territory. And then when you get your 1 mile, you take I have a hatchet here. I actually have 3 axes, but you take your axe and put a chop, or your hatchet and put a chop in a tree. And he says 1 chop is for each square mile, 3 chops for 10 square mile. So if you have your, your vertical line from one tree to the next, which is 10 square miles, or if you do 10 individual mile plots with one chop, when you get to the 10th, you put 3 chops in the tree. And of course, that is there could be problems with that, insofar as if someone, and that's how people, parceled out their land and knew what land they owned. If they own large amounts of land, is through identifiable chops in trees or other landmarks. Now, the problem is if you're working with a creek or something, a creek could dry out or change its course once it's flooded, or someone could chop down a tree with chops in it and claim, you don't really own that land at all. So the environment changed, but that's the best thing that they could do. He says, again, I'll read, they shall begin from the extreme northwest lot of the first 100 and work easterly. Okay, from the north, and you're going to work towards the east at the top where you have Sylvania there. When the first row is to be numbered 1 to 10 is finished, a second to be numbered 11 to 20. So giving us our 10 square mile lots, these hundreds shall begin from the west and beneath the first. So you start at Sylvania and you have a spot of land this way, and you're marking off hundreds. So you have, a block of 100 square miles, right? That's why they're called hundreds. He uses this term hundreds. To ensure exactitude, the surveyor shall pay due and constant attention to the variation of the magnetic meridian and shall run and note all lines by the true meridian, certifying with every plat what was the variation of the time of the running of lines there and noted. So we're going to, physically mark off the land with chops and trees and use our chain to measure distances so we can be as accurate as possible. And we want our lines to be, not to be straight, of course, to go strictly north and south, lined up with the meridians. His language is very technical, and I just need to say this is the perfect sort of job for Jefferson, because as I say in plug one of my books here called Thomas Jefferson, a Psychobiography of an American Lion.
Hold that up again.
Jefferson was very, very anal.
Okay.
And I make the point here, and I do it in other works once I first made it here, is that Jefferson was fixated on observing things, on writing stuff down. He kept a notebook with him at all times to jot down interesting data, of recording things, and even critiquing them when critique was relevant. He might see a plow and say, well, geez, why do they make the plow like that? It's not very efficient. But he, writes stuff down like that. So he's a perfect guy for something like this because he loves math. He likes details. And, I think in spite of his grumbling at times, his grousing, he enjoyed tasks very much like this.
Jefferson, the surveyor.
His father was a surveyor. His father surveyed with George Washington, with a very young George Washington. So
that may be why he knows so much, growing up, being exposed to the lingo. Sure. And okay,
well, he had some knowledge of surveying himself, certainly from his father. And his father, with Fry, came up with the first really good map of Virginia. Jefferson came up with another one himself when he did his, but his father, Peter Jefferson, with Joshua Fry, I don't remember, but comes up with the first real detailed map of Virginia from all the surveying that they've done. And Jefferson was so proud of his father coming up. His father was a self-educated person. He's very proud of that map.
Wow. Oh, that's another thing I did not know. Question 3. The first principle, they shall forever remain a part of this Confederacy of the United States of America, makes me think of secession of the Southern states. Were they bound by the same contract when they entered the Union as states?
Well, this question, I think, doesn't need a lengthy answer. They're bound by the Articles of Confederation, which really didn't do much of a job of binding anything. Again, we talked about the taxation. The government was deep in debt at the time from the Revolutionary War.
Mhm.
And they, wanted the states in some sense voluntarily to, offer up money, to give taxes, but it had no power of enforcing the taxation. So many of the states just didn't do that. There's no strong central government to be able to do that. The Articles of Confederation did not have any capacity to oversee commerce. So commerce and treaties too along the lines. So commerce was in the hands of individual states, and that could be a difficult thing, because I mean, if Virginia has commercial relationships with, say, France, on behalf of what entity is the commerce being conducted? Jefferson goes to Paris as the minister plenipotentiary to Paris. He becomes that within a year, takes over Franklin's job. But on behalf of what authority? Plenipotentiary means he's given all the full powers to give treaties. But under whose authority is he, on behalf of whose authority is he speaking? Is he conducting these treaties? He's a Virginian on behalf of the Continental Congress, but does the Congress in some sense in the article speak for all states? So there are all sorts of problems with the Articles of Confederation, and they demand that any law that's going to pass has to have consent of 9 of the 13 states, or roughly 2/3. So there are problems with the articles. So to answer your question, you talked about secession as well. I mean, the articles, the Continental Congress, really in the Association of States was a very, very loose sort of conglomeration or association, and the only glue was the Articles of Confederation, and that there was great need of a constitution, and that was the difficulty. The difficulty was to bring in a constitution that could sort of coalesce things, could bring all these things together, could speak from one power authority. But the difficulty then becomes, what about the state's authority? If the Congress if the Constitution gives too much power to a centralized federal government, which is what the Constitution is trying to do, what's the relationship between the federal government and the individual states? That's something we'll have to discuss on a further one. What was Jefferson's position?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting, I want to hear that. We have so many things we need to discuss. Question number 4. I'd like to examine the principle 4 a little closer. It states that the new states' respective governments shall be republican. The United States had just defeated the monarchy for their independence. Why would it be necessary to specify that the new territories would need to be republican?
Well, you don't want authoritarian governments in there. I mean, because there's going to be an ideological, political clash between the different nations. And, there are all sorts of problems already just having 13 different states, each one which is roughly speaking politically independent of each other. In Jefferson, by political independence, it means you can do whatever you want politically, but his own proviso here is that you can do whatever you want so long as you remain Republican, right? So long as you buy in. And what he means by Republican is that you have elected officials, you participate fully in affairs, you have freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and things like that. So there needs to be a sort of a philosophical similarity between the nations for them to be able to get along. He says even when he gets into the Louisiana Purchase, whether all this land west of the Mississippi is going to be part of, and he wanted to be part of the American nation, but whether it doesn't have to be, but as long as it's Republican, as long as the people, if it's a separate nation, if it's Republican, then they're going to at least have political similarities. They'll be simpatico politically and less inclined to want to go to war. So he wants to get rid of monarchy, make sure there's no king or something there. So we have these other problems.
And he was right. And just in recent research, learning how the American Revolution was the catalyst for other revolutions, Mexico and France, and how they wanted.
Tons of revolutions.
Yeah, and we were
Revolutions going on today.
yeah,
The
we were the
idea,
model.
what was distinct about the American Revolution, again, a topic for another time, two things at least. One is that, we talked about this during emails during the week about, Gordon Wood's thesis is that, the taxes were plenty, but they were sufferable. They were not insufferable. They were not intolerable. So what was going on here? And in effect, what was going on is just, it wasn't the amount of taxation. It was just the number of taxes and the whole notion of, we don't have any say. You're just going to impose taxes on us without even asking us.
Right.
And of course, that can piss you off.
Yeah.
So that it's a revolution. And this is what sort of irks me with my state of development, with my research on Jefferson, is the people today, the hardcore progressives on the left, and I'm not left or right, but the hardcore progressives do everything they can to bash the founding fathers and Thomas Jefferson, especially, without realizing that these people gave us the liberty to bash them.
Right.
Right. And then these idiots who also bash, and I use the word idiots intentionally, are monetizing tremendously.
Right.
Look what they do at Monticello. They're making tens of $millions every year just to destroy Thomas Jefferson, and publicly we allow that to happen. So,
well, we don't. Well, that's why we're here today.
Well, we're trying to fight that, and
education.
I hope people don't think that this is, we're politicizing here.
No.
It's just a matter of trying for the truth. It's just
right. Education.
The founding fathers are not perfect. Jefferson was close to, as far as I'm concerned, but they fought a revolution for, strongly speaking, for an idea.
Right.
Freedom. Jefferson at least did. And that's a very powerful thing that people are going to die for, so that the next generation of people can have a free environment that it's worth dying for. Now, whether it is or not is a different question, but Jefferson certainly thought it was.
Yeah, it is.
You think so? I mean, not to digress, but look what's going on again. I'm Ukrainian. Look what's going on in Ukraine. I was listening to Al Jazeera this morning. They're talking about the premier, the prime minister of China is probably going to be elected for another 5 years. And they were talking about the extent to which censorship exists in China. And, you could say, well, did the Chinese people really give a darn? Because, the economy is robust. They're eating fairly well. So if there's corruption, and if there are all sorts of spies looking at everything that they're doing, someone might say, I really don't care. There's food on my table. And that's a viable answer. But
right.
to someone, here's the test. And going back in my Ukrainian ancestry, I've known people who lived in Ukraine. Talk to someone who's lived in both societies. And this is Plato's answer. And this is John Stuart Mill's answer. Talk to people who have been, who lived in an environment where there's no freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and then talk to people who live, the same people, if they live in an open, there's easily a preference for freedom of speech. Right. It's the people who don't have it understand just how great it is.
Right.
So the people who criticize, I invite you to go live in Soviet Russia. Right. Where Putin will tell you everything is peachy. We're winning the war. Everything is great, and it's not a war anyways, right?
Yeah.
It's a special military operation.
You're funny. Question number 5, and we're almost out of time. We have about 9 minutes left.
That's why I'm funny today. I wish.
Question number 5. What are we to get from this somewhat dry report? Can you talk about Principle 5, abolition of slavery? And we have about 9 minutes left. So. Okay,
so I'll plug this book here. You asked me to do so. This is
yes.
Talk about the 1784 report. It's called Jefferson's Political Philosophy and the Metaphysics of Utopia. And that was published by Brill. Again, if anybody wants an autographed copy of one of these books, just email me. We'll talk about it later. But first off, I want to underscore Jefferson's sense of optimism and timeliness. Now, Washington was a gradualist apropos of acquisition of the Western lands. If you do something too quickly, you run the risk of doing it wrong, pissing off the people, especially the northern states, right? With our industrial and fishing, boating states. Because these are going to be farming states without question. But Jefferson really thought, no, the time is right. His timeliness, let's do it now. And his optimism. And second point I make is his vision, his obsessive passion for order. Jefferson was a farmer. He was an architect. He was a landscaper. He was a gardener, all those things. And again, if I say, Jefferson looked at land more than any person in America of his time, perhaps any politician. And I say this in several writings, he saw possibilities. Now imagine just going out to an empty parcel of land anywhere out in the country, forested or empty, whatever, and just sit there and try to figure out, what can I do with this land? It's not a matter of imposing a thought on the land. It's a matter of studying the soil, studying the climate. Is it dry? Is it wet? What sort of things grow here? What can we do? Can we build on it? Can we not? If it's swampy, right? So he had an obsessive passion for order. If you look at the grids again, he wanted rectangles, right? They're the easiest with which to work, but he was a neurotic that way. I'll add his sense of justice. Now, he wanted to buy the lands from the Native Americans, and he offered them a fair price. People were doing that all the time and screwing the Native Americans by not offering a fair price. Jefferson, even as president, was obsessive about making sure that if we're going to be buying land from Native Americans, that the price is a fair price. So he had a clear sense of justice and a clear sense that people were not deserving of land just because of their titles, but they had to. My dog is jumping up and down, little Jefferson. A couple more things. And this attends upon the third point, his disrelish of the artificial aristocracy, his relish of equality. Again, going right back to the last point, Thomas Jefferson wanted the land to be going out to people or corporations who could buy the land and develop it. You just didn't get it because you had a name, because I was born into something. Lastly, you mentioned the institution of slavery. He mandates in this bill, and of course this didn't pass, at least in that way. In the Northwest Territory, the same thing passes, is that there's the whole idea of abolishing slavery in these territories in the year 1800, right? And the notion of that was just to give people time to get used to the idea, to get wedded to that institution. So those are some things, to get out of it. I think Jefferson, like I said, he was the perfect person to hand this task, to head this committee.
Yeah.
Because he likes to measure stuff. He could use his math. He could talk about chops and trees. He could use a survey, go back to the time when he's a lad and his dad was a surveyor. Man. Oh, and another thing, I almost forgot to mention this. Jeff, sit down. You want to come on my lap? The names, right, of these states. In my book that's not yet published, The World Without Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson comes up with names for these 10 states. In the Northwest Ordinance, they say that states will be no more than 5, no fewer than 3. He's got Sylvania, Michigania. If you can put up that other slide that we had of parceling the lands. Caranessas. Let me look at the names here. We have Michigania. We have Sylvania. Silva was Latin for wooded area. Illinois, which is Native American. Metropotamia and Polypotamia. Potamos is Greek for river, and Palu is many, so many rivers, that area. And Sylvania is a wooded area. Okay, so talk about, look at all the trees over there. Chersonesus. Chersonesus is peninsula, which is modern Michigan. So he's drawing from Native American, Greek, Latin sources, and then he throws in Washington to show the tremendous respect he has for Washington. And all I can say is, in my unpublished book yet, The World Without Thomas Jefferson, the ghost that appears to Jefferson talks about, this, when Jefferson, he goes, did anybody other than I notice, Thomas, that you probably spent more time on coming up with the names for these lands than in writing the whole report? You probably were delighted, were ecstatic about thinking about what names can I give these territories, some of which survived, like Michigan, Illinois, even though it's not quite, Michigan is displaced, right, where Wisconsin is. But he loved words. He loved languages. He loved Greek and Latin. He loved Native American languages and the English language. And I think he probably wrote the report, then he sits down for a week and tries, I got to come up with the names.
Yeah.
And they better use my name. So that's what I wanted to end with.
Oh, that's.
And I almost forgot to talk about that. What a great thing.
I know we always run out of time. We need more time. But
he was a kid. And I want to add that without one scholar, Jack McLaughlin, said rightfully, Thomas Jefferson never grew up. Yeah. He was just a child. He had fun all the time. When he complained at times, I have to write these damn letters, but sort of like, I understand it because I have fun when I write. Just putting sentences together can be exhilarating. I know that sounds weird. I find the same exhilaration in creating sentences. People don't see that when they read my stuff. He had fun. He had fun when he wrote. So I'll leave you to.
It is. It really is, and it's wonderful for the people who do respect and appreciate it. It's wonderfully entertaining and exhilarating reading your work. So anyone who would like to an autographed book, you can contact Dr. Holowchak at mholowchak@hotmail.com. And or you can reach him on his Facebook page, Thomas Jefferson, Bring Him Home to Monticello, Citizens for Change, and he would be happy to book a conference or sign an send you an autographed copy of his book. And if you have not read Dr. Holowchak's work, I suggest you read anything you can. He's a wonderful writer, and he's engaging from the beginning to end. Anything on Thomas Jefferson is.
Okay, I thank you. I'm just letting you know we have to before this dies.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holowchak, for sharing your expertise and all of the studying you have done on Thomas Jefferson. I appreciate you sharing that with us today.
Thank you. I'll just give my teaser for next week before we're cut off from.
We are going to be cut off.
Jefferson's political philosophy was hand in glove with his educational views. Okay. Both of which were founded on his moral views. People will disagree with that, other scholars, but they're wrong. His educational views had to fit hand in glove with his political philosophy. And next week, we'll look at his bill for the more general diffusion of knowledge. One of his great bills one of 126 bills